Welcome to the Atheist in Recovery podcast, where we talk about finding hope in recovery. And now your host, Dr. Adina Silvestri.
Hola, Atheists in Recovery, and welcome to episode 105 of the Atheists in Recovery podcast. And today is an interview with me. The tables have been turned, and as you can hear, at least in the beginning, I'm definitely a little bit nervous about this. It's a topic that I've probably run from my entire life, and that's vulnerability. And this episode is a Q&A on why I think vulnerability sucks, and I don't think I'm alone in that feeling. What made me even want to start to address it head on, where I am now with vulnerability. And let me tell you, it's a work in progress. It is a work in progress. And so I also talk about one way that I've learned to really work through my vulnerability, and that's with writing. And writing has become a huge part of my life. So we talk a little bit about that as well. And I've sort of came up with this quote. It's probably a combination of a few quotes, but I think of writing as a creative act of internal disruption because it brings everything out. And you start to make connections with your former self and your current self, and you start to see how, at least for me, I started to see how vulnerability really led to, failed relationships, failed friendships. Professionally, there was a lot there that I could have done better if only I would have just leaned into my vulnerability. And also, I'm hoping that people take away from this episode that you can walk through vulnerability too. And I think a lot of society sort of deals with vulnerability in a couple different ways. One is we try and numb it. We try and numb vulnerability. We try and numb the guilt and the shame and the fear. And then we also try and control it through certainty, and we can see that just through our political system alone. This is the way I think about things. This is the way I feel, and end of story. So let's talk about my interviewer. And Tim, my interviewer, actually told me at the end of this episode that in his oral histories, he doesn't talk a lot. He just lets the individual just talk. And so you're going to hear that there's not a lot of dialogue. And that's one reason why there isn't a lot of dialogue in this one. But I'm sure they'll be around too. Like I said, I am no vulnerability expert. And so I'm hoping that this episode helps in some small way to get you to think about addressing your own vulnerability. Okay. Tim Hensley. Tim is the director of collections at the Virginia Holocaust Museum. Tim's career began as an oral historian, and his work with his oral histories continues with his position at the Virginia Holocaust Museum. He regularly writes and presents at conferences on museum theory, genocide studies, community archives, and oral histories. In addition to his work at the Virginia Holocaust Museum, he has also served as the board of directors for several local nonprofits who do aid work in post-genocide regions in Africa. He spends some of his free time, along with a small group of fellow archivists, collecting large social media data sets to provide documentation of current social events for historians and social scientists. His current project is collecting data sets for Virginia's 2021 election cycle, and he is also my very close friend. All right, guys, on to the show. Tim Hensley, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So you are here in a very different kind of episode where I'm going to be the one answering the questions. And I'm slightly nervous, but I'm less nervous because we are close friends. So, at least I hope we are. And I brought you on because I thought that you would be a good person to interview me. You know me really well. You do this for a living. As I've mentioned in the intro, you're an archivist and you do oral histories. And so this is going to be a piece of cake for you.
Well, I hope so.
Yeah. Should we tell the listeners how we met as a lead-in?
We met playing football, right?
I think so. Yeah.
Was that what it was?
Yeah.
Okay.
And my NFL days are sadly over now, but that's how we met when I first moved to Richmond, like 19 years ago, maybe.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I mean, it was probably 2005, maybe something like that.
Wow.
That we met 2005 or 2006, I would think. Yeah. And we were playing on a co-ed, flag football team.
Right.
Yeah.
That's been history from there on out. So, okay. So you're here to do a little Q&A with me about a journey that I've been on recently, just sort of identifying my origin story and really sort of helping me to shape my perspective on my life and also helping others, hopefully, at the end of this agonizing interview will be to help others see that even though vulnerability does suck, there's purpose behind it.
That's correct. So why don't we jump in?
Yeah.
And since we're talking about vulnerability and the difficulties associated with it, why don't you start by explaining to us what vulnerability means in this particular context?
Okay. So when I think of vulnerability, I think of rotten eggs and the smell of ash and slimy words and all these beautiful images. But when if I were to put it into words, it would be showing up as your authentic self, showing up when it's difficult, showing up when you don't know what the outcome is going to be, showing up and not knowing if people are going to stay with you or leave you. So showing up with an open heart.
Can you tell us what was happening that made you realize that you might need to address your own vulnerability?
Yeah. So this is a tough one because I know that it goes all the way back to childhood. But if I were to talk a little bit about just recent events, we don't want to get too deep here, at least not the first go round, right? So it would be when I started my hypnotherapy training. I started this hypnotherapy training, and part of the process was that you as the therapist had to be hypnotized. And so I went 3 days just going in and out of trance. And what I saw was my inability to let go, my inability to be present in the moment, not wanting to talk about the hard stuff. At one point, I almost threw up. I mean, I was literally in a fist fight with vulnerability. And so, the more you have a problem, the more you're fighting the vulnerability. Obviously, the more you have a problem with it. So that's probably more recently when I knew that I needed to start working on some of this stuff. My motto sort of growing up was that you figure out the messy and then you somehow get rid of it. So I started my career not as a therapist, but I was on track to work in forensics in the federal marshals. I eventually wanted to be at the FBI. I had all of my internships were in the forensics population. I really loved the deviant mind. I loved going in, figuring it out. And then I wanted to put it to rest. I wanted to move on. And so then I realized that when I was in my counseling program, the opposite was true. It was, and I wasn't very comfortable with this in the beginning. It was life is messy, dig in and embrace it. And so that was just a very different message. And I didn't feel as comfortable in that program as I did in the forensic population where I wanted to start.
And that's a pretty good lead in to the next question, because coming from that point of view and wanting to and moving into something completely different,
Yeah.
you obviously were handling things in a different way. So can you talk a little bit about how you previously handled vulnerability?
Yeah. I didn't want to deal with it. I mean, I would literally sort of run from it, kicking and screaming. It wasn't comfortable. I grew up in a family that really the motto was suck it up. And, you know, and very, yeah, that was like a very common saying. And so I would deal with vulnerability by, you know, anger was one way. Like anger would certainly come out in me, just not wanting to deal with that fear or that place of uncertainty.
Having grown up myself, obviously in the 1970s,
Mm-hmm.
am I wrong? But this seems like a very, even if you had a good home life, even if your home life was as close to what people would refer to as normal as possible,
Mm-hmm.
isn't that really kind of how that was a societal idea, is that you would just kind of deal with it?
Yeah. No, I think you're right. You would just sort of deal with it and then move on to the next thing. No, I hear that actually pretty often. So yeah, I would agree with that.
So how do you approach your vulnerability now?
Yeah. So it's been a process, and that's why I wanted to have this episode where I talk about it, because by no means am I a vulnerability expert at this point, but you know, I feel like we use stories as reminders, as protection, as prevention. I mean, even to the littlest example of, you know, asking my partner for help with something still feels very vulnerable and hard to do at times. But I would say learning from the journey with the hypnotherapy and then to my clients who I feel in a lot of ways are vulnerability heroes, to this podcast, this very public facing entity where there's not a lot of room to hide. So you are come as you are on this medium. And so I think that I'm learning to just sort of show up in a more authentic way by writing. So I'm doing a lot of writing that I've never done before. And if you're new to the podcast, you'll see some of the writings if you subscribe to the newsletter. So that's how I'm dealing with it. And connection. I think when I feel those feelings sort of come up into my body, you know, that, and I know what it feels like, you know, it's going to be different for everyone, but it's like lump in my throat. Then I just sort of have to take a deep breath, and what's the worst that can happen? I think I've cried this past year in front of way too many strangers. And so I mean, that's been nice because, you know, here's the thing with vulnerability. Connection is what's going to get us through. Connection is what gives meaning to our lives. And I know that from just looking at my writings and thinking through the different really difficult parts of my life. That's being accepted for who I was. has gotten me through. When I look at my clients, the more protective factors they have, the easier it is that for them to keep living. So I know that connection is a big part of it. In my relationships, I feel like they're deeper when I'm showing up, when I want to run, when I'm showing up in an authentic way, when I just want to run and hide. So those are a few examples, I think. The writing really has helped, though. And it's that writing and then hearing other people talk about their stories and thinking, holy shit, what? You're my new hero. So I guess I'm collecting heroes these days.
So can you talk a little bit about your writing? Is this, I'm assuming this is nonfiction writing for the most part.
Yeah, it's for the most part nonfiction writing. And so it's the process, and this could be any process, but this is just the process that this group is using, is there'll be a prompt, and they'll give you a prompt like, right now I am, or what I wish I told you is, and then you write for 10 minutes and stop. And then everybody in the group shares the writing. And so it's not unlike mutual help groups, really. There's no agenda. And it's just a really safe place. So that's sort of the structure of the writing group. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but, and then, just looking at some of these, I've been doing this for now 2 years, I think. And so the first time I did the writing group, I was nowhere near writing what I'm writing now. It was just me sort of observing and sort of dipping my big toes in. But recently, I've really just sort of jumped in the deep end, and my writing has really, I think, shown where I am in the stage of life, and also the stories that I tell myself. And that's the other really awesome thing about writing, is that you're able to look at where you were and then where you are now and then where you want to go. And so the stories that maybe helped keep you alive when you were younger aren't the stories that are helping you at all right now. And so I think that's the other thing that I really love about writing, is you're able to start to put those puzzle pieces together to form this narrative of who I am right now, which of course changes all the time, but yeah.
So it really comes out as a form of journaling, basically. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to share?
Just sort of to remind people that you don't have to be a writer. I don't identify as a writer. To sort of start this process, you just have to put pen to paper. And then when you feel comfortable, just start to share it. Just share it with anyone that you feel comfortable sharing with, because I think that's also how we're able to connect. I see your pain, I see who you are, and I'm here, and I'm here anyway. I'm not going anywhere. And I think a lot of the people that come to see me have a problem with that, with the unlovable parts of themselves, the unbelonging parts. And that's, I think, one way to overcome that is to know that you are loved and you do belong. And, this is just one way to start that process. So,
okay.
Well, I'm sure there'll be a part 2 to this. And so stay tuned, everyone. I think that the podcast also is going to change a little bit in the upcoming months. And so look to the newsletter for information on that, because yeah, we're about to sucker punch shame. And I know that it's a problem that everybody has. And I feel like if we could just show up and not numb, which is something that I think happens throughout society. Not numb, not try to control the outcome like we see in politics and religion, but to just show up and connect. I think that it will be just a very different place. So anyway, I'll stop there. Thanks again, Tim, for interviewing me.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Atheists in Recovery podcast. For more great info and to stay up to date, head over to atheistsandrecovery.com.